The distant whistle of a train echoed through the valley as Flora Palmer clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching the sunrise paint the Wyoming sky in hues of orange and gold. 3 months pregnant and alone, she had arrived in Laramie with nothing but a small carpetbag of belongings and a heart full of broken promises. The father of her child, a smooth, talking railroad man, had disappeared east with the railway expansion, leaving behind only a hastily scribbled note and the growing evidence of their brief love affair beneath her loosened corset. The wooden platform creaked beneath her worn boots as she surveyed the dusty Main Street. Laramie in 1876 was a far cry from her genteel upbringing in Boston. The frontier town bustled with activity despite the early-hour cowboys leading horses to the livery, shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks, and wagon wheels cutting fresh tracks in the unpaved roads. "First time in Laramie, miss?" The station master's voice startled her from her thoughts. Flora nodded, one hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "Yes, sir, I'm looking for work and lodging." The older man scratched his graying beard. "Widow, are you?" The lie came easily to her lips. "Yes, my husband passed suddenly." She fought to keep her voice steady, knowing that a pregnant, unmarried woman would find no respectable employment in a town like this. "Sorry to hear that," the station master said, his eyes softening with sympathy. "Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house might have a room. As for work," he gestured down the street, "the Silverbuck Saloon's looking for a new cook, and Doc Miller mentioned needing help with his practice." Flora thanked him and made her way down the street, conscious of curious glances from townsfolk. The boarding house proved to be a modest 2-story building with lace curtains in the windows, a touch of civilization in the rugged landscape. Mrs. Holloway, a plump woman with kind eyes, took one look at Flora's pale face and ushered her inside. "You look like you could use some breakfast, dear," she said, leading Flora to a small dining room where several other boarders sat around a long table. "Where are you from?" "Boston," Flora replied, accepting a cup of coffee with gratitude. "I'm seeking employment." Mrs. Holloway nodded sagely. "Not easy for a woman alone out here. What skills do you have?" "I can read and write. I've managed household accounts and correspondence. I can cook and I have some knowledge of nursing." Flora had been raised to be a proper lady, but her father's gambling debts had forced her to develop practical skills that would now prove essential to her survival. Before Mrs. Holloway could respond, the front door opened with a bang, and a tall figure filled the doorway. The room fell silent as a man removed his wide-brimmed hat, revealing sun-bronzed features and piercing blue eyes that immediately found Flora's face across the room. "Quentin Garrison," Mrs. Holloway announced with obvious affection. "You're just in time for breakfast. Come meet our newest boarder, Miss Palmer from Boston." The cowboy crossed the room in long strides, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floorboards. His presence seemed to fill the entire space not just with his considerable height, but with an undeniable authority that spoke of a man accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life. "Miss Palmer." He extended a calloused hand, and Flora found herself momentarily speechless as she placed her smaller one in his grip. "Welcome to Laramie." "Thank you, Mr. Garrison." She withdrew her hand quickly, unnerved by the spark of awareness that had traveled up her arm at his touch. "Quentin's foreman at the Triple G Ranch," Mrs. Holloway explained. "One of the largest spreads in the territory." The cowboy took a seat across from Flora, his intense gaze making her uncomfortable. "What brings a Boston lady to Wyoming territory?" he asked directly. "A fresh start," she answered, meeting his eyes with determination. She would not be intimidated, not even by this imposing man. Something in her expression seemed to amuse him, and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Plenty of those to be had out here if you've got the fortitude for it." "I believe I do, Mr. Garrison." Breakfast continued with conversation flowing around her, but Flora remained acutely aware of Quentin's occasional glances. When the meal concluded, she excused herself and went to unpack her meager belongings in the small room Mrs. Holloway had shown her. Later that morning, Flora ventured to Dr. Miller's office, a modest building with a shingle proclaiming medical services hanging above the door. The doctor, a balding man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, seemed relieved when she inquired about the position. "Heaven sent you are," he said after a brief interview. "My nurse returned east last month and I've been overwhelmed. Can you start tomorrow?" Flora agreed readily, relieved to have secured employment so quickly. As she left the doctor's office, she nearly collided with Quentin Garrison, who was tying his horse to the hitching post outside. "Miss Palmer," he greeted her, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "Already finding your way around town, I see, Doctor." "Miller has kindly offered me a position as his assistant," she replied, stepping back from his touch. Something flickered in his eyes' approval, perhaps. "He's a good man, one of the best doctors in the territory." "Yes, he seems very dedicated." Flora glanced at the blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on Quentin's forearm. "Are you injured?" "Just a scratch. Barbed wire has a mind of its own sometimes." He followed her gaze to his arm and shrugged. "Part of ranching life." "You should have that properly cleaned and bandaged," she said automatically, her nursing instincts taking over. A smile tugged at his lips. "Is that professional advice, Miss Palmer? Consider it common sense, Mr. Garrison." She gestured to the doctor's door. "I'm sure, Doctor." "Miller can attend to you now." Quentin studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I look forward to seeing more of you around town, Miss Palmer," he said finally, before tipping his hat and entering the doctor's office. Flora hurried back to the boarding house, unsettled by the encounter. Something about Quentin Garrison's penetrating gaze made her feel as though he could see right through her carefully constructed facade, right to the secret she carried beneath her heart. The following weeks established a routine for Flora. Her work with Dr. Miller proved both challenging and rewarding. The doctor was impressed with her knowledge and gentle manner with patients, and Flora found satisfaction in being useful. She carefully set aside as much of her modest wages as she could, knowing that her condition would eventually become apparent and potentially threaten her employment. It was on a crisp autumn morning, nearly a month after her arrival in Laramie, that Flora first felt the baby move a fluttering sensation that brought both joy and fear. Her secret wouldn't remain hidden much longer. That same afternoon, Quentin Garrison arrived at the doctor's office with a ranch hand who had been thrown from a horse. As Dr. Miller tended to the young man's dislocated shoulder, Quentin observed Flora efficiently preparing bandages and medicines. "You've settled in well," he commented when they were momentarily alone. Flora nodded, keeping her eyes on her task. "Laramie has been welcoming. And yet you keep to yourself. Mrs. Holloway says you rarely join the other boarders in the evenings." She looked up then, surprised by his observation. "I'm often tired after work, and I prefer reading to socializing. All work and no enjoyment makes for a lonely life, Miss Palmer. Perhaps I'm accustomed to loneliness, Mr. Garrison." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Flora immediately regretted the vulnerability they revealed. Quentin stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The harvest dance is this Saturday at the town hall. Would you do me the honor of accompanying me?" The invitation caught her completely off guard. I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Garrison." His eyebrows rose slightly. "And why is that?" "I'm in mourning," she reminded him, clinging to her fabricated widowhood. "Forgive me," he said, though something in his expression suggested he didn't entirely believe her story. "Perhaps another time, then." Before she could respond, Dr. Miller returned, and Quentin excused himself to see to his injured ranch hand. That night, as Flora prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about Quentin's invitation. In another life, one where she wasn't carrying another man's child and hiding behind a web of lies, she might have been flattered by the attention of such a man. But romance was a luxury she could no longer afford. The harvest dance came and went without Flora's attendance, but the following week brought an unexpected development. A sudden influx of patients with a mysterious fever overwhelmed Dr. Miller, and Flora found herself working long hours. By the end of the third day, she was exhausted, her back aching and her feet swollen from standing. "You should rest," Dr. Miller told her as they finally finished with the last patient well after midnight. "You're looking pale, my dear." "I'm fine," Flora insisted, though she felt far from it. The pregnancy was beginning to take its toll, and the loose dresses she had taken to wearing would soon be inadequate to conceal her condition. As she stepped out into the cold night air, she was surprised to see Quentin leaning against a post outside the doctor's office, holding the reins of a horse and buggy. "What are you doing here, Mr. Garrison?" she asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Waiting to escort you home," he replied matter-of-factly. "It's late, and you shouldn't be walking alone." Too tired to argue, Flora allowed him to help her into the buggy. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet. They rode in silence for several minutes, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves the only sound. "You work too hard," Quentin said finally. Flora sighed. "Says the man who runs one of the largest ranches in the territory," he chuckled, a warm sound in the cold night. "Fair point. But I wasn't raised as a Boston society lady." "Neither was I, not really," she admitted. "My father lost everything when I was 16. I've been working since then, one way or another." "And your husband?" The question hung in the air between them. Flora looked away, focusing on the distant mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "He's gone," she said simply, hating the deception but seeing no alternative. When they reached the boarding house, Quentin helped her down from the buggy, his strong hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. In that brief contact, Flora feared he might feel the subtle swell of her abdomen, but if he noticed, he gave no indication. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Garrison," she said, stepping back from him. "Quentin," he corrected. "I think we've known each other long enough for that." "Flora, then," she conceded with a small smile. "Get some rest, Flora." He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything at all, you need only ask." She nodded, oddly touched by his concern. "Good night, Quentin." The following Sunday, Flora awoke to the sound of rain pattering against her window. With no patients to tend, she had planned a quiet day of mending and letter writing. But as she dressed, a sharp pain in her abdomen caused her to double over, gasping. When the pain subsided, she pressed a hand to her now visible pregnancy, worry creasing her brow. At 5 months along, she shouldn't be experiencing such discomfort. Perhaps it was nothing, just the normal aches of carrying a child, but a nagging fear prompted her to seek Dr. Miller's opinion. The rain had intensified by the time she reached the doctor's house, her cloak soaked despite the umbrella she carried. Dr. Miller ushered her inside with concern, immediately noting her pallor. "How long have you been experiencing these pains?" he asked after she explained her symptoms. "Just since this morning," Flora replied, wincing as another spasm gripped her. The doctor's examination was thorough and professional. When he finished, he sat beside her with a serious expression. "Flora, I believe you're experiencing a threatened miscarriage. The baby's heartbeat is still strong, but you need complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks." Fear clutched at her heart. "Will I lose the baby?" "Not if we're careful," he reassured her. "But you cannot continue working, not until this passes. And I must insist on honesty between us now. How far along are you exactly? And what happened to the father?" Tears filled her eyes as the full story spilled out her brief affair with the charming railroad surveyor, who had promised marriage only to disappear once she revealed her pregnancy. Her journey west to escape the scandal that would have destroyed her in Boston. The lie about widowhood to protect what remained of her reputation. Dr. Miller listened without judgment, patting her hand when she finished. "You're not the first woman to be deceived by a silver-tongued rogue, and you won't be the last. What matters now is your health and that of your child. But how will I survive without working?" Flora asked, despair threatening to overwhelm her. My savings won't last 2 weeks, the doctor thought for a moment. Let me speak with Mrs. Holloway. She's a good Christian woman with a kind heart. Perhaps between us we can arrange for your care until you're able to return to work. Before Flora could respond, a commotion at the front door interrupted them. Quentin Garrison's voice carried through the house, urgently calling for the doctor. Dr. Miller excused himself, and Flora could hear the murmur of conversation from the next room. A moment later, both men appeared in the doorway. Quentin's expression shifted from concern to confusion when he saw her. Flora, what are you doing here? Dr. Miller glanced between them. Miss Palmer is unwell and needs rest. I was just about to arrange for her return to the boarding house. What's wrong? Quentin asked, his brow furrowing as he took in her pale face and the way she pressed a hand protectively to her midsection. The doctor hesitated, looking to Flora for permission to speak. After a moment's consideration, she nodded slightly. There was no hiding the truth any longer. Miss Palmer is expecting a child, Dr. Miller explained gently. She's experiencing complications that require complete bed rest. Quentin's face remained unreadable as he processed this information. I see. His gaze locked with Flora's, questions evident in his blue eyes. And the father? That's not relevant, Dr. Miller interjected, but Flora shook her head. It's all right, doctor, she faced Quentin squarely. There is no husband. I was deceived by a man who left when he learned of the child. I came west to start anew. She expected disgust or judgment, but Quentin's expression softened unexpectedly. That took courage, he said quietly. Dr. Miller cleared his throat. Miss Palmer needs transportation back to the boarding house and someone to explain the situation to Mrs. Holloway. I would go myself, but I've just received word that Mrs. Donovan is in labor with twins. I'll take her, Quentin said without hesitation, and I'll speak with Mrs. Holloway. Before Flora could protest, Quentin had swept her into his arms as though she weighed nothing, cradling her against his broad chest. This isn't necessary, she objected, flustered by his actions. I can walk. Not in your condition and not in this weather, he replied firmly, carrying her to the waiting buggy outside. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but Quentin still wrapped her carefully in a dry blanket before setting off toward the boarding house. They traveled in silence, Flora too embarrassed by her situation and too concerned about her child's welfare to make conversation. At the boarding house, Quentin carried her to her room despite her protests, then went to speak privately with Mrs. Holloway. Flora could hear their muffled voices from the parlor but couldn't make out the words. When Quentin returned, his expression was resolute. It's arranged. Mrs. Holloway will bring you meals and check on you regularly. I've paid for your room and board for the next month. Flora's eyes widened in shock. I can't accept that, Quentin. It's too much. Consider it an advance, he said, surprising her further. I've been looking for someone to keep the books for the Triple G. Once you're well enough, you can work for me and repay the debt if your pride demands it. Tears welled in her eyes at his unexpected kindness. Why would you help me? You barely know me. Quentin sat carefully on the edge of her bed, his gaze direct and unflinching. Because everyone deserves a second chance, Flora. And because I've come to care for you, despite your determination to keep everyone at arm's length. Before she could respond, he stood and moved toward the door. Rest now, I'll check on you tomorrow. True to his word, Quentin visited daily during Flora's confinement, bringing books to alleviate her boredom and news of the outside world. Sometimes he simply sat in the chair by her bed, discussing ranch business or telling stories of his own journey west from Virginia after the war. Under Dr. Miller's care and with the enforced rest, Flora's condition stabilized, and by the end of 2 weeks, she was allowed to move about her room. It was during this time that Flora began to see beyond Quentin's rugged exterior to the thoughtful, intelligent man beneath. His kindness extended not just to her, but to everyone in his orbit, from the youngest ranch hands to the Chinese laundry workers many in town treated with disdain. He spoke to her as an equal, valuing her opinions and respecting her independence even as he insisted on helping her. On the day Dr. Miller finally cleared her for light activity, Quentin arrived with an unexpected proposal. "I've had a cabin prepared at the Triple G," he announced without preamble. "It's small but comfortable with everything you'll need. You can start the bookkeeping work whenever you feel strong enough." Flora stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to live at your ranch? The cabin is private, set apart from the main house and bunkhouse. You'll have independence but also the security of people nearby should you need help." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Flora, you're going to have a baby in a few months. Do you really want to be alone in a boarding house when that happens?" The practicality of his suggestion was undeniable, but Flora hesitated. "What will people say? A single woman living on your property." "They'll say you're my bookkeeper, which you will be." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Besides, my housekeeper, Mrs. Caldwell, is a formidable chaperone. No one would dare suggest impropriety under her watch." Still, Flora wavered. "I don't know, Quentin. It seems like I would be taking advantage of your generosity." "Nonsense. I need a bookkeeper and you need a safe place to have your child. It's a fair arrangement." He paused, studying her face. "Unless there's another reason you're reluctant." There was, though Flora could hardly admit it even to herself. Living in closer proximity to Quentin would only deepen the feelings that had begun to take root in her heart, feelings that could never be reciprocated by a man of his standing once her child was born. But what choice did she have? Her position with Dr. Miller had been filled during her absence, and while he had promised to hire her back after the baby came, that left several months without income. And Quentin was right, having the baby alone in a boarding house was a daunting prospect. "When would you want me to move?" she asked finally. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Tomorrow, if you're able. I've already spoken with Mrs. Holloway." And so the next day found Flora seated beside Quentin in his wagon, her belongings packed in the back, heading toward the Triple G ranch. As they left the town behind, the land opened up around them, rolling hills covered in autumn gold grass stretching toward distant mountains. The beauty of it momentarily took Flora's breath away. "It's magnificent," she murmured. Quentin nodded, pride evident in his voice. 15,000 acres from the creek yonder to those foothills. Took me 5 years to build it up from nothing." "You came here with nothing?" Flora asked, genuinely curious about his past. "Just the clothes on my back, my horse, and a burning desire to own land that no one could take from me." There was an old pain in his voice that resonated with Flora's own experiences of loss. The main house of the Triple G came into view as they crested a hill, a substantial 2-story structure of weathered wood with a wide porch wrapping around it. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, and beyond them stood the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. A short distance away, nestled beneath a stand of cottonwood trees, sat a small cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. "Your new home," Quentin said, nodding toward the cabin. "Mrs. Caldwell has been preparing it all week." The cabin proved to be more comfortable than Flora had expected. Though simple, it boasted a snug bedroom, a small parlor with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen with a cast iron stove. Mrs. Caldwell, a stern-faced woman with silver-streaked black hair, had stocked the pantry and prepared a hot meal that waited on the stove. "Thank you," Flora said sincerely as she surveyed her new quarters. "This is more than I could have hoped for." Quentin seemed pleased by her reaction. "The office is in the main house. When you're ready, I'll show you the books." True to his word, Quentin had a substantial backlog of accounting for Flora to organize. The ranch's finances had been haphazardly maintained, with receipts stuffed in drawers and expenses noted on scraps of paper. Flora threw herself into the task, grateful for meaningful work that distracted her from concerns about her future. As October gave way to November, Flora settled into life at the Triple G. The ranch operated like a small, self-contained town, with each person playing a vital role in its success. She came to know the ranch hands' hard-working men who treated her with respect after an initial period of curiosity, and Mrs. Caldwell, whose gruff exterior concealed a kind heart. But it was Quentin who occupied her thoughts most often. They worked closely together, reviewing the ranch's finances and planning for the coming winter. Sometimes he joined her for dinner in her cabin, bringing venison he had hunted or books from his surprisingly extensive library. Their conversations ranged from literature to politics to their respective pasts, and Flora found herself sharing confidences she had never revealed to anyone. "My father killed himself when the creditors came," she admitted one evening as they sat before her fireplace. "He couldn't face the disgrace of bankruptcy. My mother followed within the year consumption, the doctor said, but I think it was heartbreak." Quentin's hand covered hers briefly. "I'm sorry, Flora," she nodded, accepting his sympathy. "After that, I lived with my aunt in Boston. She arranged for me to work as a companion to an elderly lady. That's where I met him, Daniel." She rested a hand on her growing belly. "He was surveying for the railway, staying at my employer's home. He was charming, educated, and completely without conscience, as it turned out." "Some men don't deserve the name," Quentin said, his voice hard. Then, more gently, "What will you do when the baby comes?" Flora had asked herself the same question countless times. "Raise my child as best I can," she answered simply. "Work, build a life for us somehow. Alone." The question hung in the air between them. "I have little choice in the matter," she replied, unable to meet his gaze. "Few men would willingly take on another man's child." Quentin said nothing to that, but his thoughtful expression stayed with Flora long after he had gone. As December arrived, bringing with it bitter cold and snow that transformed the landscape into a vast white expanse, Flora's pregnancy advanced to the point where movement became uncomfortable. Still, she continued working, organizing the ranch's books with meticulous care and preparing for the year-end accounting. It was during a particularly fierce blizzard, with wind howling around the cabin and snow piling against the windows, that Flora felt the first strong contractions. She had experienced false labor pains before, but these were different, more intense, more regular. Fear gripped her as she realized that her child was coming nearly a month early, and in the midst of a storm that made travel to town impossible. She tried to remain calm, remembering what Dr. Miller had told her about childbirth. She added wood to the fire, boiled water, and laid out clean linens. But as the contractions intensified and came closer together, panic began to set in. She was alone, with no one to help her through what lay ahead. A particularly strong contraction doubled her over just as a knock sounded at her door. When she could straighten, Flora made her way across the room, relieved beyond measure to find Mrs. Caldwell on her doorstep, snow dusting her shawl. "Thought you might need checking on in this storm," the older woman said, her sharp eyes quickly taking in Flora's condition. "The baby's coming, isn't it?" Flora nodded, another contraction stealing her breath. "Right then. Let's get you to bed, Mrs. Caldwell said, taking charge with efficient calm. "I've helped birth more babies than I can count, both human and animal. You're in good hands." What followed were hours of pain unlike anything Flora had ever experienced, interspersed with periods of exhaustion when she feared she could not continue. Mrs. Caldwell proved to be a skilled midwife, her gruff encouragement giving Flora strength when her own began to fail. "Someone's coming," Mrs. Caldwell said suddenly, pausing in her preparations as the sound of heavy footsteps approached the cabin. The door burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and a snow-covered Quentin. "Mrs. Caldwell, is everything?" He stopped abruptly when he saw Flora, his face paling beneath his tan. "The baby, on its way," Mrs. Caldwell confirmed. "Make yourself useful and bring more firewood." For the next several hours, Quentin remained in the cabin, keeping the fire blazing and fetching whatever Mrs. Caldwell requested. Though he stayed in the main room, out of sight of Flora's birthing bed, his presence provided an unexpected comfort. Just as dawn was breaking, with the storm finally abating outside, Flora's daughter entered the world with a healthy cry. Mrs. Caldwell cleaned and wrapped the infant before placing her in Flora's arms. "She's perfect," Flora whispered, tears streaming down her face as she gazed at the tiny, red-faced creature who had caused her so much fear and now inspired such overwhelming love. "She is," Mrs. Caldwell agreed. "A fine, strong girl. I'll go tell Mr. Garrison the good news." Moments later, Quentin appeared in the bedroom doorway, hesitant in a way Flora had never seen him before. "May I come in?" Flora nodded, too exhausted for speech but wanting to share this moment with him. He approached the bed slowly, his eyes fixed on the bundle in her arms. "Would you like to hold her?" Flora asked. Surprise flashed across his face, followed by something softer. "I would." She carefully transferred her daughter to his arms, watching as the big, rough-handed cowboy cradled the newborn with unexpected gentleness. He studied the baby's face for a long moment, then looked at Flora with an expression that made her heart skip a beat. "She looks like you," he said softly. "She'll be beautiful." "Thank you for being here," Flora managed, emotion tightening her throat. "I don't know what I would have done without you and Mrs. Caldwell." Quentin returned the baby to her arms, then sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "What will you name her?" Flora looked down at her daughter, considering. "Grace," she decided. "Grace Elizabeth Palmer." "A good name," Quentin approved. Then, with an odd note in his voice, "What about her surname?" Flora frowned slightly. "Palmer is her surname, my name. It could be Garrison instead." The words hung in the air between them as Flora stared at him in disbelief. "What are you saying, Quentin?" He took a deep breath. "I'm saying that I love you, Flora Palmer. I have almost from the moment I saw you. I'm saying that I want to marry you if you'll have me. And I'm saying that this child, your daughter, could have my name. I would raise her as my own with all the love and care any father could provide." Flora's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. "But she's another man's child." Quentin shook his head. "She's your child, and she could be mine too in every way that matters." He reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. "Then the baby will have my name, and so will you if that's what you want." Tears filled Flora's eyes as she looked at this strong, honorable man who was offering her everything she had thought forever beyond her reach, not just security and respectability, but love. "True love, freely given. Are you certain?" she asked, needing to be sure. "Once done, it can't be undone. People will always know she came before our marriage." "Let them know," Quentin said firmly. "I'm proud to claim both of you. The only question is whether you want me, Flora. Do you think you could love me in time?" Flora laughed through her tears. "In time? Oh, Quentin, I've loved you for months. I just never dared hope you could love me in return, not with my past, not with another man's child." His face lit with joy as he leaned forward to kiss her gently. "Then say yes, be my wife, let Grace be our daughter." "Yes," Flora whispered against his lips. "Yes to all of it." They were married 2 weeks later in the ranch house parlor, with Reverend Tompkins officiating and the ranch hands serving as witnesses. Flora wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Caldwell had helped alter to accommodate her still recovering figure, and Quentin wore the only suit he owned. Grace, wrapped in a white christening gown that the women of Laramie had sewn as a gift, slept peacefully in Mrs. Caldwell's arms throughout the ceremony. When Reverend Tompkins pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin kissed Flora with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Then he took Grace from Mrs. Caldwell, holding her high for all to see. "My daughter," he announced proudly. "Grace Elizabeth Garrison." The celebration that followed was boisterous and joyful, with food and drink flowing freely, and even the most hardened cowboys offering congratulations to the new family. As Flora watched Quentin move among his men, their daughter secure in his arms, she marveled at the unexpected turn her life had taken. "He's a good man," Mrs. Caldwell said, appearing at Flora's side with a cup of punch. "Been alone too long, needed someone to love." "As did I," Flora replied softly. "I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness." The older woman nodded sagely. Sometimes the Lord's greatest blessings come disguised as our greatest trials. Spring brought new life to the Triple G Ranch, calves in the fields, wildflowers on the hills, and renewed vigor to the land after winter's slumber. Flora's days fell into a pleasant rhythm of caring for Grace, managing the ranch's accounts, and building a life with Quentin that grew richer with each passing day. Their marriage, begun as an act of compassion on Quentin's part and desperate gratitude on Flora's, had blossomed into a deep and abiding love. They learned each other's habits, preferences, and histories. Flora discovered that Quentin had fought for the Union in the war despite his Virginia upbringing, that he had lost his entire family to typhoid as a young man, and that, beneath his confident exterior, lay a fear of abandonment that rivaled her own. Quentin, in turn, delighted in Flora's quick mind and quiet strength. He encouraged her to take an active role in ranch operations beyond the bookkeeping, valuing her perspective and supporting her ideas. Together, they expanded the Triple G-Ticus cattle operation, adding sheep that Flora suggested might thrive on the rocky upland pastures where cattle struggled. But it was in their role as parents that they found their greatest joy. Quentin doted on Grace, spending hours simply holding her or telling her stories about the ranch and the animals. As she grew from a newborn to an infant and began to respond with smiles and coos, his devotion only deepened. "She has your eyes," he told Flora one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues while Grace slept in his arms. "And your stubborn nature," Flora teased, leaning against his shoulder. "She already knows exactly what she wants and won't settle for less." Quentin chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her cheek. "That's my girl." The possessive pride in his voice brought tears to Flora's eyes. Never once had he treated Grace as anything less than his own flesh and blood. In public and private, she was his daughter in every way that mattered. Summer brought cattle drives and the busiest season on the ranch. Quentin was often away for days at a time, supervising the movement of herds to summer pastures or accompanying shipments to the railroad. During these absences, Flora managed the ranch operations with growing confidence, earning the respect of the hands who had initially been skeptical of the boss's city wife. It was during one such absence, with Quentin gone to Cheyenne on business, that trouble arrived at the Triple G in the form of a dusty stranger asking for Flora by her maiden name. She was in the ranch office, Grace playing on a blanket beside the desk, when one of the younger ranch hands knocked at the open door. "Mrs. Garrison? There's a man here asking for Flora Palmer, says he's an old friend from back east." Flora's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead at a gallop. Only one person from her past would seek her out here. "Where is he?" "Waiting by the corral. Told him to stay put till I spoke with you." "Thank you, Jimmy. Would you ask Mrs. Caldwell to come watch Grace? I'll speak with the visitor outside." She smoothed her skirts and checked her appearance in the small mirror by the door, noting how different she looked from the frightened young woman who had stepped off the train in Laramie nearly a year before. Her face had filled out, her skin tanned by the Wyoming sun, and her eyes held a confidence that had been lacking then. Mrs. Caldwell arrived to take charge of Grace, her sharp eyes noting Flora's tension. "Trouble, perhaps," Flora admitted. "A visitor from my past. I need to deal with this before Quentin returns." The housekeeper nodded. "The boys are all nearby if you need them. Just call out." Grateful for the woman's understanding, Flora made her way to the corral where a lean figure in travel-worn clothes leaned against the fence, watching the horses. As she approached, he turned, and Flora found herself face to face with Daniel Crawford, the father of her child. He looked much as she remembered, handsome in a polished way, with dark hair and the charming smile that had once made her heart flutter. Now she felt nothing but a cold anger. "Flora," he greeted her, as though they had parted on good terms just yesterday. "You're a difficult woman to find." "That was intentional," she replied coolly. "What are you doing here, Daniel?" He spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. Is that any way to greet the father of your child? I've come to make things right, Flora laughed, the sound brittle even to her own ears. Make things right. It's been over a year since you disappeared. The time for making things right has long passed. I had business to attend to back east, he said, his tone reasonable. Family matters. But I never stopped thinking about you, Flora, about our child. He glanced around. I heard in town that you married some rancher. Is that true? Yes, his name is Quentin Garrison. This is his ranch, our ranch. Daniel's expression darkened slightly. And my child. Did you tell this Garrison about me? I told my husband everything, Flora said firmly. And Grace is his daughter now. He gave her his name, his love, and his protection, all the things you denied her. Grace, Daniel repeated, testing the name. I have rights, Flora. Legal rights to my own flesh and blood. Fear flashed through her, quickly replaced by determination. You forfeited any rights when you abandoned us. Grace has a father, a real father who loves her. She doesn't need you. Perhaps I need her, Daniel countered, stepping closer. And perhaps I still need you. We could be a family, Flora, the three of us. I've secured a position with the railroad in San Francisco. Good money, respectable work. Come with me. Bring our daughter. Flora stepped back, disgusted by his presumption. Are you mad? I'm married, happily married. I love my husband, and he loves me and Grace. There is nothing you could offer that would tempt me away from the life we've built. Anger flashed across Daniel's handsome features. He's raising my child as his own. I can't accept that. You have no choice, Flora retorted. Grace is a Garrison now. My husband adopted her legally through the territorial court. She bears his name, and in the eyes of the law, she is his child. This was true. Quentin had insisted on the legal adoption to protect Grace's future inheritance rights to the ranch. The judge in Cheyenne, an old friend of Quentin's, had been happy to oblige. Daniel's face flushed with anger. This isn't over, Flora. I'll go to the courts myself. I'll tell them how you ran away, how you're denying me my rightful place in my daughter's life. And I'll tell them how you abandoned a pregnant woman without a penny or a promise, she shot back. Do you really want that story spread across Wyoming territory? What would your new employers think of such a man? The threat gave him pause, calculation replacing anger in his eyes. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement. I'm not without means now. I could provide financial support for the girl. She doesn't need your money. The Triple G is one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Then what do you want, Flora? What will it take for you to be reasonable about this? Before she could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Quentin was riding toward them, his expression thunderous as he recognized the confrontation taking place. He dismounted in one fluid motion, striding toward them with the loose-limbed grace that always reminded Flora of a predator. Everything all right here, Flora? He asked, his voice deceptively mild as he took his place beside her. Yes, she replied, drawing strength from his presence. Mr. Crawford was just leaving. Daniel assessed Quentin with a wary eye, clearly recognizing the physical threat the taller, broader man represented. But he maintained his composure, extending a hand that Quentin ignored. Garrison, I presume? I'm Daniel Crawford, Grace's father. You're mistaken, Quentin replied evenly. I'm Grace's father. The courts and God Almighty recognize it as so. Daniel's smile tightened. Blood tells, Mr. Garrison, that child carries my lineage, not yours. A man is more than blood, Quentin said, his voice hardening. A father is the one who loves, protects, and provides. The one who walks the floor at night with a colicky infant. The one who will teach her to ride and read and face the world with courage. He stepped closer to Daniel, using his height advantage to intimidate. Where were you when she was born in the middle of a blizzard? Where were you for her first smile, her first word? Daniel faltered under Quentin's unwavering gaze. I'm here now. Too late, Flora interjected. Much too late. Please leave, Daniel, there's nothing for you here. For a moment, it seemed he might argue further, but Quentin's steadfast presence and Flora's resolute expression apparently convinced him of the futility. This isn't the end of the matter, he said finally. I'll be in Laramie for the next week. Think about what I've said, Flora. Think about what's best for Grace." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in his wake. As soon as he was out of sight, Flora's composure crumbled and she turned to Quentin with tears in her eyes. "He wants to take Grace." He threatened court action. Quentin gathered her into his arms, his embrace solid and reassuring. "He won't take her, Flora. The adoption is legal and binding. No judge in the territory would side with a man who abandoned his responsibilities. But what if he tries to appeal to a higher court? What if he has influential friends? Then we'll fight him with everything we have," Quentin promised. "Grace is our daughter and nothing will change that." They spent a restless night discussing options and contingencies. Quentin sent a ranch hand to Laramie the next morning with a message for their lawyer, requesting his immediate presence at the Triple G. By afternoon, Mr. Jenkins had arrived, his saddlebags bulging with legal documents. "The adoption is ironclad," he assured them after reviewing the situation. Mr. Crawford abandoned both mother and child, providing no support and making no attempt to establish paternity until now. No court would look favorably on such a claim. "But we should be prepared nonetheless," Quentin insisted. The lawyer nodded thoughtfully. "It would be wise to gather affidavits from those who knew of Miss Palmer's condition when she arrived in Laramie, the doctor, Mrs. Holloway, perhaps the station master who first met her. Their testimonies would establish the abandonment." For the next several days, they focused on strengthening their legal position. Dr. Miller provided a detailed statement about Flora's condition upon arrival and the absence of any support from the child's biological father. Mrs. Holloway similarly attested to Flora's circumstances as a woman alone. But it was Mrs. Caldwell's testimony that proved most compelling. Her vivid account of Grace's birth during the blizzard, with Quentin present and supporting Flora throughout, established his commitment to the child from her very first breath. A week passed with no further appearance from Daniel. Then, too, Flora began to hope that he had abandoned his quest as easily as he had once abandoned her. But Quentin remained vigilant, instructing the ranch hands to be alert for strangers and ensuring that Grace was never left without trusted supervision. Their caution proved warranted when Daniel appeared again, this time accompanied by a sharp-eyed man in a suit whom he introduced as his attorney from Denver. "I've consulted with Mr. Hendricks here about my rights," Daniel announced when Flora and Quentin received them in the ranch house parlor. "He believes I have a strong case for at least visitation rights, if not shared custody." The attorney cleared his throat. "Mr. Crawford has biological ties to the child that cannot be severed simply because another man has stepped into the paternal role. While the adoption may have legal standing, it was processed without the biological father's knowledge or consent. Because he had abandoned both mother and child," Quentin pointed out, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He made no attempt to provide support or even acknowledge the pregnancy." Mr. Jenkins, who had been summoned as soon as the visitors were spotted approaching, stepped forward. "My clients have assembled considerable evidence of Mr. Crawford's abdication of responsibility. Any court would view his sudden interest with extreme skepticism, particularly given the timing after the child is born. After another man has provided for both mother and infant, after a legal adoption has established a new family unit." The debate continued, growing increasingly heated as both sides presented arguments. Flora, holding Grace protectively throughout, finally reached her breaking point when Daniel suggested that the child would benefit from knowing her real father. "Enough," she exclaimed, rising to her feet. "This discussion is pointless. Grace is happy, healthy, and loved. She has a father who has been present since her birth, who has given her his name and his heart. What possible benefit could come from disrupting her life to satisfy your sudden paternal interest, Daniel?" Her outburst silenced the room. Even Grace, who had been contentedly playing with a wooden toy Quentin had carved for her, looked up at her mother's raised voice. Daniel's attorney shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Garrison, no one wishes to disrupt the child's life unnecessarily. But my client has rights he willingly abandoned, Flora interrupted. When I told Daniel I was carrying his child, do you know what he did, Mr. Hendricks? He left a note saying he wasn't ready for the responsibilities of family life and disappeared. He left me penniless, pregnant, and alone. She took a steadying breath. I had to travel across the country to build a new life for myself and my unborn child. If not for Quentin's kindness and love, we might not have survived. The raw emotion in her voice seemed to affect even Daniel, whose confident demeanor faltered. Flora, I made a mistake. I'm trying to make amends now. Some mistakes can't be undone, she replied softly. Some choices have permanent consequences. You chose to leave. Quentin chose to stay. Grace is his daughter now in every way that matters. A tense silence followed her words. Then Daniel's attorney cleared his throat again. Perhaps we should discuss this further in private, Mr. Crawford. The two men stepped outside, leaving Flora, Quentin, and Mr. Jenkins in the parlor. Grace, oblivious to the tension surrounding her future, babbled happily as she attempted to stand using Quentin's leg for support. That's it, sweetheart, he encouraged, momentarily distracted from the legal battle. You'll be walking before we know it. The sight of them together, Quentin's large hands gently supporting Grace's tiny ones, the adoration in his eyes as he looked down at her brought fresh tears to Flora's eyes. This was real fatherhood, not the biological accident that had connected Grace to Daniel. When the visitors returned, Daniel's expression had changed. The aggressive confidence was gone, replaced by a resigned weariness. My attorney advises me that a court battle would be lengthy, expensive, and potentially damaging to all parties, including Grace, he said. I'm willing to consider alternatives. Relief flooded through Flora, though she remained cautious. What alternatives? Daniel glanced at his attorney, who nodded encouragingly. I would be willing to formally relinquish any claim to Grace in exchange for certain considerations. Quentin's jaw tightened. You want money? I prefer to think of it as providing for her future in my own way, Daniel replied smoothly. A sum that you would invest for her education or dowry, and perhaps occasional updates on her welfare, not visits, just information. Flora and Quentin exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Then Quentin turned back to Daniel. We'll consider your proposal, but any agreement would need to include your complete legal surrender of all paternal rights and claims, now and in the future. The negotiations that followed were tense but productive. By evening, they had reached an agreement. Daniel would sign papers relinquishing all rights to Grace in exchange for a sum that would be placed in trust for her future, accessible only when she turned 21. He would receive annual letters with news of her development, but would make no attempt to contact her directly. As the attorneys finalized the documents, Daniel requested a moment alone with Flora. Quentin was reluctant but eventually agreed, remaining within earshot in the adjoining room. I did care for you, Flora, Daniel said quietly when they were alone. Perhaps not enough and certainly not as you deserved, but I did. I believe you, she replied, surprised to find that the anger she had carried for so long had diminished. But caring isn't enough for a family. Love, true, selfless love is what Grace needs. It's what Quentin gives her, and me. Daniel nodded slowly. He's a good man, better than I could be for you both. He hesitated, then added, I won't trouble you again, the agreement will see to that, but I am glad to know that Grace has a real father. After the papers were signed and the visitors departed, Flora stood on the porch with Quentin, watching the dust from their horses fade into the distance. Grace was asleep inside, peaceful and secure in her crib, unaware of how her future had been decided that day. Do you think we did the right thing? Flora asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. Quentin wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Yes, this gives Grace the security of knowing her place in our family can never be challenged. And if someday she wants to know about her biological father, we have the means to tell her the truth without fear. Flora turned to face him, reaching up to touch his weathered cheek. You are her father, Quentin, in every way that truly matters. Blood doesn't make a family, love does. He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. I've loved her since the moment I first held her, still wet from birth and squalling like a mountain lion. Just as I've loved you since you stood up to me that first day in the boarding house, looking so proper and Boston-like but with fire in your eyes. Flora laughed at the memory. I thought you were the most intimidating man I'd ever met, and the most handsome, she added with a smile. And now? He asked, pulling her closer. Now I think you're the best man I've ever known, the best husband, the best father. She stretched up to kiss him softly. I love you, Quentin Garrison. And I love you, Flora Garrison, he replied against her lips. The years that followed brought prosperity to the Triple G and joy to the Garrison family. Grace grew into a spirited child with her mother's intelligence and her father's fearlessness. She learned to ride almost before she could walk properly, sitting proudly before Quentin on his horse as they inspected the ranch. When Grace was 3, Flora gave birth to a son they named James Quentin Garrison. 2 years later, twin girls Elizabeth and Margaret joined the family. Throughout each pregnancy and birth, Quentin was as attentive and supportive as he had been with Grace, never showing the slightest preference for his biological children over his adopted daughter. Indeed, Grace held a special place in his heart as his firstborn, the child who had made him a father. He taught her everything he knew about ranching, delighting in her quick mind and natural affinity for the work. By the time she was 10, she could ride as well as any ranch hand and had a keen eye for cattle breeding that even the old-timers respected. On Grace's 12th birthday, after the celebration with family and the ranch hands had concluded, Flora found her husband standing alone on the porch, watching their eldest child organizing the younger children in a game. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, slipping her arm through his. Quentin smiled down at her, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. Though his dark hair now showed threads of silver at the temples, he was still as handsome to her as the day they'd met. "I was thinking about how lucky I am," he replied. 12 years ago, I was a lonely man with nothing but this land and work to fill my days. Now I have a family that makes it all worthwhile." Flora leaned against him, contentment warming her despite the autumn chill in the air. "Do you ever regret it, taking on another man's child?" "Taking on me with all my complications," Quentin turned to her, his expression serious. "Not for a single moment. The day Grace was born was the day my life truly began, and the day you agreed to be my wife was the day I became the richest man in Wyoming territory." He kissed her forehead gently. "Some men search their whole lives for the kind of happiness I found with you and our children." Inside the house, baby cries signaled that the twins had awakened from their nap. James's voice could be heard asking Grace a question about his birthday, present a small pony that Quentin had been training for months. The sounds of their family, their life together, surrounded them like a blessing. "We should go in," Flora said, though she was reluctant to leave this moment of quiet togetherness. Quentin nodded but didn't move, instead drawing her closer for a kiss that, even after years of marriage, still made her heart race. "I love you, Flora Garrison," he murmured against her lips. "More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, the words as true now as they had been when first spoken. "Always and forever." Hand in hand, they returned to the warmth of their home, and the family they had built together, a family founded not on blood or obligation, but on the enduring power of love and choice. For in the end, it wasn't bloodlines that made them a family. It was the daily decision to love, to support, to forgive, and to cherish one another through all of life's challenges and joys. And whenever Flora looked at Grace, her firstborn, her brave and beautiful daughter, she remembered the words that had changed her life forever. "Then the baby will have my name." In those simple words, Quentin had offered not just his name, but his heart, creating a family bound by love stronger than any ties of blood could ever be.